A.5.3 Building the Syndicalist Unions. Just before the turn of the century in Europe, the anarchist movement began to create one of the most successful attempts to apply anarchist organizational ideas in everyday life. This was the building of mass revolutionary unions, also known as syndicalism or anarcho-syndicalism. The syndicalist movement, in the words of a leading French syndicalist militant, was, open quote, a practical schooling in anarchism, for it was a laboratory of economic struggles and organized along anarchic lines. By organizing workers into libertarian organizations, the syndicalist unions were creating the free associations of free producers within capitalism to combat it and, ultimately, replace it, end quote. While the details of syndicalist organization varied from country to country, the main lines were the same. Workers should form themselves into unions, or syndicates, the French term for union. While organization by industry was generally the preferred form, craft and trade organizations were also used. These unions were directly controlled by their members and would federate together on an industrial and geographical basis. Thus, a given union would be federated with all the local unions in a given town, region, and country, as well as with all the unions within its industry into a national union of, say, miners or metal workers. Each union was autonomous and all officials were part-time and paid their normal wages if they missed work on union business. The tactics of syndicalism were direct action and solidarity, and its aim was to replace capitalism by the unions providing the basic framework of the new free society. Thus, for anarcho-syndicalism, open quote, the trade union is by no means a mere transitory phenomenon bound up with the duration of capitalist society. It is the germ of the socialist economy of the future, the elementary school of socialism in general. The economic fighting organization of the workers gives their members every opportunity for direct action in their struggles for daily bread. It also provides them with the necessary preliminaries for carrying through the reorganization of social life on a libertarian-socialist plan by their own strength, end quote. Anarcho-syndicalism, to use the expression of the IWW, aims to build the new world in the shell of the old. In the period from the 1890s to the outbreak of World War I, anarchists built revolutionary unions in most European countries, particularly in Spain, Italy, and France. In addition, anarchists in South and North America were also successful in organizing syndicalist unions, particularly Cuba, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. Almost all industrialized countries had some syndicalist movement, although Europe and South America had the biggest and strongest ones. These unions were organized in a confederal manner, from the bottom up, along anarchist lines. They fought with capitalists on a day-to-day basis around the issue of better wages and working conditions and the state for social reforms, but they also sought to overthrow capitalism through the Revolutionary General Strike. Thus, hundreds of thousands of workers around the world were applying anarchist ideas in everyday life, proving that anarchy was no utopian dream but a practical method of organizing on a wide scale. That anarchist organizational techniques encouraged member participation, empowerment, and militancy, and that they also successfully fought for reforms and promoted class consciousness can be seen in the growth of anarcho-syndicalist unions and their impact on the labor movement. The industrial workers of the world, for example, still inspires union activists and has, throughout its long history, provided many union songs and slogans. However, as a mass movement, syndicalism effectively ended by the 1930s. This was due to two factors. Firstly, most of the syndicalist unions were severely repressed just after World War I. In the immediate post-war years, they reached their height. This wave of militancy was known as the Red Years in Italy, where it attained its high point with factory occupations. See section A.5.3. But these years also saw the destruction of these unions in country after country. In the USA, for example, the IWW was crushed by a wave of repression backed wholeheartedly by the media, the state, and the capitalist class. Europe saw capitalism go on the offensive with a new weapon: fascism. Fascism arose first in Italy and most infamously in Germany as an attempt by capitalism to physically smash the organizations the working class had built. This was due to radicalism that had spread across Europe in the wake of the war ending, inspired by the example of Russia. Numerous near-revolutions had terrified the bourgeoisie, who turned to fascism to save their system. In country after country, anarchists were forced to flee into exile, vanished from sight, or became victims of assassins or concentration camps after their, often heroic, attempts at fighting fascism failed. In Portugal, for example, the 100,000-strong anarcho-syndicalist CGT Union launched numerous revolts in the late 1920s and early 1930s against fascism. In January 1934, the CGT called for a revolutionary general strike, which developed into a 5-day insurrection. A state of siege was declared by the state, which used extensive force to crush the rebellion. The CGT, whose militants had played a prominent and courageous role in the insurrection, was completely smashed, and Portugal remained a fascist state for the next 40 years. In Spain, the CNT, the most famous anarcho-syndicalist union, fought a similar battle. By 1936, it claimed 1.5 million members. As in Italy and Portugal, the capitalist class embraced fascism to save their power from the dispossessed, who were becoming confident of their power and their right to manage their own lives. See section A.5.3. As well as fascism, syndicalism also faced the negative influence of Leninism. The apparent success of the Russian Revolution led many activists to turn to authoritarian politics, particularly in English-speaking countries and, to a lesser extent, France. Such notable syndicalist activists as Tom Mann in England, William Galasher in Scotland, and William Foster in the USA became communists. The last two, it should be noted, became Stalinist. Moreover, communist parties deliberately undermined the libertarian unions, encouraging fights and splits, as for example in the IWW. After the end of the Second World War, the Stalinists finished off what fascism had started in Eastern Europe and destroyed the anarchist and syndicalist movements in such places as Bulgaria and Poland. In Cuba, Castro also followed Lenin's example and did what the Batista and Machado dictatorships could not, namely smash the influential anarchist and syndicalist movements. See Frank Fernandez's Cuban Anarchism for a history of this movement from its origins in the 1860s to the 21st century. So, by the start of the Second World War, the large and powerful anarchist movements of Italy, Spain, Poland, Bulgaria, and Portugal had been crushed by fascism, but not, we must stress, without a fight. When necessary, the capitalists supported authoritarian states in order to crush the labor movement and make their countries safe for capitalism. Only Sweden escaped this trend, where the syndicalist union, the SAC, is still organizing workers. It is, in fact, like many other syndicalist unions active today, growing as workers turn away from bureaucratic unions whose leaders seem more interested in protecting their privileges and cutting deals with management than defending their members. In France, Spain, and Italy, and elsewhere, syndicalist unions are again on the rise, showing that anarchist ideas are applicable in everyday life. Finally, it must be stressed that syndicalism has its roots in the ideas of the earliest anarchists and, consequently, was not invented in the 1890s. It is true that development of syndicalism came about, in part, as a reaction to the disastrous propaganda by the Deed period, in which individual anarchists assassinated government leaders in attempts to provoke a popular uprising and in revenge for the mass murders of the communards and other rebels. See section 8.2.18 for details. But in response to this failed and counterproductive campaign, anarchists went back to their roots and to the ideas of Bakunin. Thus, as recognized by the likes of Kropotkin and Malatesta, syndicalism was simply a return to the ideas current in the libertarian wing of the First International. Thus, we find Bakunin arguing that, open quote, "It is necessary to organize the power of the proletariat, but this organization must be the work of the proletariat itself. Organize, constantly organize the international militant solidarity of the workers in every trade and country, and remember that however weak you are as isolated individuals or districts, you will constitute a tremendous, invincible power by means of universal cooperation." End quote. As one American activist commented, this is, open quote, "the same militant spirit that breathes now in the best expressions of the Syndicalist and the IWW movements, both of which express a strong worldwide revival of the ideas for which Bakunin labored throughout his life." End quote. As with the Syndicalists, Bakunin stressed the, open quote, "organization of trade sections, their federation, bear in themselves the living germs of the new social order, which is to replace the bourgeois world. They are creating not only the ideas, but also the facts of the future itself." End quote. Such ideas were repeated by other libertarians. Eugène Varlin, whose role in the Paris Commune ensured his death, advocated a socialism of associations, arguing in 1870 that syndicates were the natural elements for the rebuilding of society. Open quote, "It is they that can easily be transformed into producer associations. It is they that can put into practice the retooling of society and the organization of production." End quote. As we discussed in section A.5.2, the Chicago anarchists held similar views, seeing the labor movement as both the means of achieving anarchy and the framework of the free society. As Lucy Parsons, the wife of Albert, put it, open quote, "We hold that the granges, trade unions, knights of labor assemblies, etc., are the embryonic groups of the ideal anarchistic society." End quote. These ideas fed into the revolutionary unionism of the IWW. As one historian notes, the, open quote, "proceedings of the IWW's inaugural convention indicate that the participants were not only aware of the Chicago idea, but were conscious of a continuity between their efforts and the struggles of the Chicago anarchists to initiate industrial unionism." End quote. The Chicago idea represented, open quote, "the earliest American expression of syndicalism." End quote. Thus, syndicalism and anarchism are not differing theories, but rather different interpretations of the same ideas. See for a fuller discussion, section H.2.8. While not all syndicalists are anarchists, some Marxists have proclaimed support for syndicalism, and not all anarchists are syndicalists, see section J.3.9 for a discussion why, all social anarchists see the need for taking part in the labor and other popular movements and encouraging libertarian forms of organization and struggle within them. By doing this inside and outside of syndicalist unions, anarchists are showing the validity of our ideas. For as Kropotkin stressed, the, open quote, "next revolution must, from its inception, bring about the seizure of the entire social wealth by the workers in order to transform it into common property. This revolution can succeed only through the workers, only if the urban and rural workers everywhere carry out this objective themselves. To that end, they must initiate their own action in the period before the revolution. This can happen only if there is a strong workers' organization." End quote. Such popular self-managed organizations cannot be anything but anarchy in action.